Hey everyone, this is Haley and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to tackle one of my most favorite genres, and that would be the historical fiction. So let's go ahead and start with one of my all-time favorites, Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. And this initially is told in first person from the perspective of Chiyo. You start out the story with two sisters, Chiyo and her younger sister Satsu. Her father ends up selling them. The more beautiful sister, Chiyo, is sold to a geisha house, and the younger sister, Satsu, is sold to a brothel. And whenever Chiyo arrives at the geisha house, a rivalry between Hatsumomo, the most beautiful and highest earning geisha, been reading too much Shadow and Bone, geisha of the time, quickly become enemies. And she makes sure that Chiyo's training is put to a stop through betrayal and tricks. Now, a few years later, you pick up the story and another mentor from another geisha house picks up Chiyo's training, and she becomes an unparalleled success. I will say that this does have a romance in it, but the love interest is so sparingly mentioned, and not in a bad way. It just mentions him enough to where you have this sorrowful longing and this beautiful ache that I thought was artfully done in a way that the love interest and the romance just adds something to the storyline and it doesn't overpower it. It also takes place in World War II, but it's so far removed from the initial plot line that you're pretty far removed from any kind of military activity, and it just adds details to the story, just like the love interest does. The intrigues and the culture of the geisha community and society were absolutely mesmerizing. I loved learning about this culture and things that I had no idea. Now, before I started this video, I did a little further research into this novel and the author, and I kind of discovered something that tainted this a little bit for me. I found out that this author was supposed to write this novel as an anonymous retelling of the prolific geisha Iwasaki. And he accidentally or carelessly really acknowledged her in his sources. He took a little bit more creative license with the material than what she expected, on top of revealing her identity. If you have any further recommendations regarding the Japanese culture and geisha society, please link them in the comments below, because I would like to include more Japanese authors and female authors at that. And you can't have a list of best historical fiction without The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. This is just such a compelling coming of age, loss of innocence story set during World War II. And initially you begin the story through the eyes of Death, who ends up being the narrator. You are introduced to this book thief that he mentions, and her real name is Liesel, but she's found at the grave of her brother who has just died, and she ends up stealing a gravedigger's handbook, and that's the first of many thefts of books that she ends up performing. I love that the author furthered the storyline through Death's eyes and the books that Liesel stole along the way. And Death begins to recount the times that their paths have crossed. Now, it's woven throughout the escalating events of World War II, and so Liesel, through the eyes of a child, you get to witness the horrendous acts against the Jewish community. And set against this backdrop of Nazi horror, you also get to see Liesel form these relationships around her. She has a neighbor, Rudy, who is not a sympathizer with the Nazi cause and ends up being one of her best friends and somewhat of a love interest, but she's so young that it's not really even considered one. Max, who is a refugee in her foster parents' basement, and then also the mayor's wife, ends up fostering her love of learning and education when she realizes that Liesel is stealing books from her library. So it is compelling. I love that the author furthered along the story with a love of reading and literature, and then also color, because he used color and descriptions throughout the storyline to distract and to add and complement to the time and to the storyline, and I absolutely love that. Now, just refreshing myself, I started tearing up, so there's no way I can't include this on one of my favorites for historical fiction. Any other list, you'll probably find this on there. It has sold over 8 million copies worldwide. It's been translated into 30 languages, and it actually, I found out, took the author over 200 rewrites to get this the way he wanted it. It definitely worked. It definitely lives up to the hype. The next one is a book that I read after I had watched the Netflix series Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. And no, contrary to my husband's belief, I did not start these books for a detailed description of Jamie Fraser's abs. I thoroughly went into this because I had little to no knowledge of Scotland and the Jacobite Rebellion, and I felt like this provided me such a unique historical perspective with a pretty heavy fantasy element on top of that. So you initially start out the story with Claire Randall, who is a British army nurse. It is post-World War II, the war has just been won, and her husband Frank are enjoying a second honeymoon in Scotland. They're trying to figure out who they are in this marriage that they started before the war and have spent so much time apart. So the fantasy element is introduced when Claire is transported back into 18th century Scotland through a set of magical standing stones on Craignadoon. She finds herself nearing the events of the Jacobite Rebellion and the return of Bonnie Prince Charles. So this was a topic that I knew very little about. I didn't really know many details about Scotland's rebellion and revolt against England, so I was very interested in the topic. I think her historical research was more than substantial. You go through events such as the Battle of Culloden, the Jacobite Rebellion, as well as the aristocracy of Paris during that time, and I believe King Louis XV was the monarch during the time then. And further along the story, it actually ends up going to America and America's colonization with the fight for independence. So it's pretty heavily inclusive of the Native Americans as well as the slavery subjects that went on during the time. It was pretty heavily researched, and all of them are really chunky. It's not purely a romance, unlike the Netflix series would have you believe. Now, I do think that the love and the bond between Jamie and Claire is pretty unparalleled in a lot of the novels that I've read, with such a heavy history aspect on the side. And I hate that this is a TV cover. I cannot stand that, but it just so happens that this is the only hard copy I have, and the rest of them are on Kindle. I've read up to the 5th novel, and I usually try to read a novel per season because I really don't want to ruin it for myself as I'm watching the cinematic experience. So they're pretty close to the novel timeline and the novel details, but they do differ somewhat, so it really wouldn't be too much of a spoiler if I were to read ahead. All of her characters that Diana introduces are memorable and lovable. The villains are absolutely cruel and you hate them to the very core. Trigger warning, there are some very horrific scenes of sexual assault and torture throughout the novels. There are 8 published so far. I think she has 10 planned total, but there's quite a few spin-offs from Lord John Grey. He's a very popular character within the series that ended up getting his own series. So if you run out of material in this, Diana has plenty more for you to enjoy. And of course, I had a pre, during, and now I'm going to include a post-World War II novel. This is Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson, and it follows a post-World War II murder mystery that explores anti-Japanese sentiment. You really follow 3 main characters. You have Ishmael, a reporter who is covering the story. You have Hatsue, who is the wife of the man accused, and then also Kabuo, who is the accused murderer, without much evidence to back it up. Through a series of flashbacks, you learn that Ishmael and Hatsue were childhood best friends and then adolescent lovers. So on top of the anti-Japanese sentiment and the prejudices that were present at the time, you also have that jealousy and envy love interest as well to thicken and tangle the plot. I thought it was tastefully done, and it was like heartbreaking and aching because you experience Ishmael's loss and the trauma that he suffers post-war because he's returning home. He is a veteran who has lost an arm. So you get to see PTSD in action, and I thought that he did a tremendous job exploring the dynamics of mental illness and post-war mentality. So the traumas of war and PTSD are pretty thoroughly explored, as well as the conditions of the Japanese internment camps that were present at the time and conveniently glossed over or altogether removed from my public education. It also delves into Ishmael's internal struggles as he grapples with his faith after the war, and also the struggles of the Japanese soldiers who fought for the US during the war and the prejudices that they still faced after coming home. It was such a compelling novel, and the human frailty that the author added in surrounding the central theme and the plot lines just added such an aching, beautiful loss that made you feel for these characters and suffer right alongside them. And it was actually one that so much happened, and the storyline was so long and full of detail that right at the end it just wraps up, and you're like, wait, that was it? That was all? Well, I mean, it came to a great conclusion, but it happened so fast that you're not expecting the trial and the activity and the action and the plot line to just end. It ends in a very satisfying way, but I still wasn't prepared for how quickly everything wrapped up. And last on the list is probably a novel that has made me cry more than any other ones. It is from the author of The Kite Runner, and it is A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. And this story is set in modern day Afghanistan. You follow two female protagonists, Miriam and Layla, who both find themselves through very similar and tragic circumstances married to a shoemaker, Rashid, and he is an abusive alcoholic. It follows the rise of the Taliban in tandem with the severe restrictions on women's rights. There are many trigger warnings throughout this storyline. There is a suicide that is briefly touched upon. There's physical and sexual assault, as well as the tortures and injustices that were just inflicted upon the women in this book. You truly felt like you were suffering alongside them emotionally and physically. Hosseini did such an excellent job with just creating a compelling storyline and just laying bare the traumatic experiences of these two women in this polygamous relationship with this man. The women were beautiful characters. I love this book. I think about this all the time. I cried so hard. It is one that I recommend all the time to people. It explores the mother-daughter dynamic, whereas The Kite Runner explored the father-son dynamic. So both of them were excellent novels. Anything he writes is an automatic buy for me. This is one of the most tragic and agonizingly gut-wrenching stories that I have ever read. Expect to cry if you pick up any books from him. They're all fantastic, and a lot of them are included in school curriculum these days, as harsh and tragic and severe as the content is, but well worth it. And the themes and the lessons and the trauma that we learn from in these books are unparalleled, in my opinion. So I know a lot of these were centered before, during, and after World War II. In the future, I'll try to include more that aren't, but it just happens that a lot of the content that is written about includes World War II because it was such a big blip in human history. So thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. See you next week.